Good morning. I hope if you're watching this, you're having a good day. And I hope to see you in class on Wednesday. We're going to begin King Lear. And in this intro, I want to talk about connection, trying to make connections to other things that I've read, trying to also kind of give people an overview of what is going on between the lines, underneath the surface of this play, as we deal with family disintegration, the disintegration of a kingdom, as we deal with all of that tragic stuff, talking about keywords, key phrases, things that you should be constantly looking for as you read this play. First of all, let's connect to nothing. One of the connections that comes to me every time I read those lines in Act 1, Scene 1, where Lear says, or Cordelia begins with nothing, my lord, and Lear responds nothing, and Cordelia says nothing, and Lear says nothing can come of nothing, speak again. It reminds me of one of the great short stories of all time, Flannery O'Connor's Good Country People. And in Good Country People, there's this line, you can see bolded on the left-hand side of the screen. Science wishes to know nothing of nothing. Such, after all, is the strictly scientific approach to nothing. We know it by wishing to know nothing of nothing. And the idea that nothing can come of nothing and we wish to know nothing of nothing, and there's a whole lot of nothing going on, means that at some point during this play, we are going to have to commit philosophy without a license and discuss the concept of nihilism. But we'll get to that later. The idea of nothing continues. And in the idea of nothing, we again have the Earl of Gloucester saying, the quality of nothing hath no such need to hide itself. Let's see. Come, if it be nothing, I shall not need spectacles. Those lines, I think, are important in a lot of ways, especially if we take a look at this idea of nothing and seeing, and the idea that one cannot see nothing because there is nothing to see. And while you're listening to this, just think of me trying to explain this in front of everybody in class. Nonetheless, I think we'll come back to the sight thing later on in this presentation because that too is part of the overall, is an overall motif for this play. Also, if we just take a look, the fool, in a lot of ways, he is going to be the wisest character. When the Earl of Kent says, "This is nothing, fool," and the fool says, "You gave me nothing for it," there's a certain amount of wisdom that the fool is going to possess throughout the play, and we're going to have to come back and pick that up as well. And speaking of the fool and his wisdom, the fool can tell Lear what Lear needs to hear. And the fool is going to be right, and Lear is going to be wrong. And the fool is certainly right by Act 1, Scene 4, when he says, I am better than thou art now. I am a fool, thou art nothing. As a king who has divided his kingdom and no longer technically has the crown, the fool is absolutely right, and this play illustrates that. There's the other thing that I think is important here, and this idea of nature. And I'm trying to be a little bit smart alecky with the title of Natural Connections. But I think when Edmund is there, is speaking at the beginning of Act 1, Scene 2, and he starts talking about to thy law, in other words, the law of nature, wherefore should stand in the plague of custom and permit the curiosity of nations to deprive me. The idea of a state of nature and following the state of nature rather than the conventions of the state gives us this conflict between the state of nature and civilization. Shakespeare is writing this play in the early 1600s. By the later 1600s, Hobbes and Locke, two philosophers, are writing about the state of nature. And in Hobbes, the state of nature was a place where it was a war of everybody against everybody, and life was nasty, brutish, and short. Locke saw it more as a state of freedom, but even in that state of freedom, one gave up some freedom to get what one lacked. In this case, it was security. And as you look at this play, I think it's entirely possible that Shakespeare's ideas about the need for security in a kingdom, the need for a kingdom to have control, the king to have control, to avoid the state of nature is a key element to it. And Edmund worshiping nature, Edmund, honoring nature and not necessarily the conventions of the state, I think show the fear of what happens if you return to that state of nature. And I think, again, we have this idea of love cools, friendship falls off, brothers divide. In cities, mutinies, in countries, discord, in palaces, treason, and the bond cracked twixt father and son. This villain of mine comes under the prediction, there's son against the father. The king falls from bias of nature. There's father against child. We have seen the best of our time, machinations, hollowness, treachery, and all ruinous disorders follow us disquietly to our graves. Life is nasty, brutish, and short. And I think if you want a summary of the play, you could do a lot worse than having the summary of the play. The thing is, this is much longer than 6 words. And again, just a quick reminder, remember that this play is set in a pagan time. This play is not set in a Christian time. These people are worshiping the pagan gods. And when you hear them talk about nature, they are talking about the earth goddess, whichever earth goddess you want to pick. But they are talking about an earth goddess. They're talking about the goddess of nature. Also, here, I think you can see that Shakespeare, once again, is doing the same thing he did with Lady Macbeth. And I think he's doing the same thing he did with Portia and Julius Caesar. Into her womb convey sterility, dry up in her the organs of increase, and from her derogate body never spring a babe to honor her. Remember Macbeth, bring forth men children only. And remember that Lady Macbeth says, take my mother's milk for gall. And remember Portia was, I can stab myself in a leg and take pain just like any man. Don't give birth. Don't do the natural thing. And so I think this is one of the things that when we look at Shakespeare, this is one of the things that's run through a lot of the tragedies. The idea of the woman moving away from what Shakespeare thought was her natural state, her natural duty. We talked a couple slides earlier about this idea of families, father against son, father against child, as in Lear and his daughters. And I think it's important to understand this idea of filial duty is an important concept throughout time. And Confucius was writing this, 1,500 years, probably 2,000 years almost, before Shakespeare wrote King Lear. But if you take a look at this idea of taking care of parents, Confucius said in the Analects, these days men regard themselves as dutiful sons simply by feeding their parents. But they also feed their dogs and horses. Unless they show their parents due respect, what's the difference? In other words, just taking care of the physical needs without taking care of the idea of parents are worthy of respect. The Old Testament 10 Commandment concept of honor thy father and thy mother, that your days may be long in the land. I think Confucius is saying, yes, you have to show them honor. He's doing the same thing as the Old Testament, the Ten Commandments did. But when we get to Lear, not only are the parents and not honored, they're not even fed and housed. I mean, Lear is spending the storm out in the middle of, with no protection at all. So, this idea of what do children owe their parents? What do parents owe the children? How can that all be paid? And how can people, deal with the idea that there was God, king, and family, and the family in Shakespeare's time, the man was supposed to be the head of the household. We'll get into that more as we go here. But the idea of duty to parents is, I think, something that the play asks us to look at. And what happens when people forget the idea of not only respect, but just care for the physical needs. The idea of age and wisdom. Remember that Macbeth talks about the idea of in old age, those things I should have, friends and respect. But Lear here is an old man, and Lear is going to talk about his age. His daughters are going to talk about his age. Okay? And they're talking about how he's changed. They're talking about he has, always been kind of hot tempered. And he's, infirm. And he is lacking he's lacking the concept of wisdom. Wisdom seems to be something that does not come with age. It is not guaranteed in this play. And when you combine with the fact that wisdom is not guaranteed, you combine the fact that the play's got a lot of references to nothing, and that the play is about sight or the lack of sight, you start getting back to the nihilism that I was talking about earlier. But you start getting to the idea of what happens when somebody is merely old but not wise. And are we dealing with Shakespeare looking at, senility, Alzheimer's, whatever our common terms for it are in 2021? The fool hits Lear with, thou shouldst not have been old till thou hadst been wise. This one always gets to me. I'm not sure I got all the wisdom I need either. Okay? As you are old and reverend, you should be wise. Should be, not are. And so we're dealing with Lear as an angry old man, a man who, wanted his daughters to praise him and didn't care whether it was true or not. And the one daughter who actually loves him, he's not wise enough to see that. And so again, we're back to sight, we're back to love, we're back to family duty. And they're all tied together in this concept of wisdom. Okay? And again, if you take a look at this, thou hadst little wit in thy bald crown when thou gavest the golden one away. The whole idea that the king should have been wise enough to know that giving up the crown was something that he should not be doing. That giving up the crown without lining up the succession, splitting the kingdom, showed a tremendous lack of wisdom. And now he's going to pay for it. The kingdom's going to pay for it. I talked earlier about the idea of sight. Again, you've got Lear. Where are his eyes? And Lear talking about, who is it that can tell me who I am? Remember earlier on one of the slides, we had the line about the daughter saying, he slenderly knew himself. Okay. Macbeth had the, to know my deed, 'tis best to not know myself. Knowing self seems to be part of the thing that runs through Shakespeare quite a bit. And it's, again, a big chunk of this play. along with sight, the idea of seeing the natural consequences, the idea of seeing that nothing good is going to come out of this search for nothing. All right, see better, Lear, something again that he ignores. And the Duke of Albany, how far your eyes may pierce, I cannot tell. Striving to better, we oft mar that what's well. Told a lot of students in my time, don't let the perfect become the enemy of the good. And I think as we're going through this play, I don't think that that's going to be a problem. It's avoiding all of the tragedies because one lacks sight. And we're making very, very clear that one is lacking sight and that one is not wise enough to understand that one is lacking sight. And then I think we've got another connection here. This one seems to me to be Iago. I see the business. Let me, if not by birth, have lands by wit. And we talk again. A credulous father and a brother noble whose nature is so far from doing harms that he suspects none. The Moor is of a free and open nature, who trusts when he shouldn't trust. In a lot of ways here, I think Edmund is repeating lines that Iago easily could have said. Remember, as you're doing these connections, a lot of times Shakespeare is creating characters that are similar to other characters we've talked about. The last thing I want to do is talk about this idea of paradox. Paradox is this literary technique where it's kind of these two things should not go together, but they do. And the first line of the King of France, fairest Cordelia, thou art most rich being poor, most choice forsaken, and most loved despised. Being loved and despised shouldn't go together. Being chosen and forsaken should not go together. Rich and poor should not go together. And yet it's this paradox, and in my weakness thou art strong from the Bible. Weakness and strength, that paradox. Taoism is full of paradoxes. Star Wars, Yoda had some paradoxes as he spoke. I think it's important as we're looking here not to forget about the lit terms that we're going through. I don't believe there's going to be a daily writing today, but let me run through some quotations very quickly. One of the most famous quotations out of Act 1 is, how sharper than a serpent's tooth it is to have a thankless child. And Edmund's line about, now gods stand up for bastards. Both of these quotations are in the same, maybe not quite as famous as, jealousy and green-eyed monsters. But I do think that there are quotations that often get quoted from Shakespeare. Now let me go back to the daily writing. I'm guessing I'm going to go long in class, and because I'm going to go long in class, we won't have a daily writing today. There will be one Wednesday. Hope to see everybody in class Wednesday. Hope everybody has a good day. Thank you very much.